In 1969, Ford built a car so powerful, so dangerous, and so politically explosive that they spent millions of dollars trying to hide it from you. They buried it in their marketing materials, told their dealers not to promote it, and even lied about how much horsepower it actually made. What you're looking at isn't just a Mustang. It's evidence of the biggest automotive cover-up in American history. And after 55 years of silence, Ford's own internal documents have finally revealed the shocking truth about what they were really hiding. This is the story of how Ford accidentally created the most powerful production car of the muscle car era, then spent decades pretending it didn't exist, because what they discovered in their own testing labs was so terrifying that they knew it could destroy the entire American auto industry. The car had a name that most people have never heard of, the Boss 429, and what Ford found out about this machine was so dangerous that they classified the information and locked it away for over half a century. But the truth always comes out eventually. And what you're about to learn will change everything you thought you knew about American muscle cars forever. The Forbidden Beast. Picture this. Ford builds what many consider the most powerful production Mustang ever made. Stuffs it with a NASCAR-bred monster engine. And then, barely tells anyone about it. No flashy marketing campaigns, no celebrity endorsements. Just 1359 cars built over 2 years, most of them collecting dust on dealer lots because nobody knew what they were looking at. The 1969-70 Mustang Boss 429 wasn't just another muscle car. It was Ford's dirty little secret. A street-legal race car that the company was legally required to build but desperately didn't want you to buy. And the reason why will shock you. See, in the late 1960s, Ford was getting absolutely humiliated on NASCAR tracks. Chrysler's Hemi engines were dominating everything, and Ford's 427 big block was starting to look like yesterday's news. Something had to be done. And Ford's solution was so extreme, so expensive, and so politically dangerous within the company that they nearly canceled it 3 times before the first car ever rolled off the production line. But here's where it gets interesting. The Boss 429 you could buy at your local Ford dealer wasn't actually the same engine that was tearing up NASCAR tracks. In fact, the street version was deliberately neutered, dumbed down, and made less powerful than what Ford was actually capable of building. Why would they do that? The answer involves corporate politics, insurance companies, and a secret that Ford kept hidden for over 50 years. What you're about to discover will change everything you thought you knew about one of America's most legendary muscle cars. Because the real story of the Boss 429 isn't just about horsepower and quarter-mile times. It's about corporate deception, engineering brilliance, and a car that was so far ahead of its time that even today, most people don't understand what they're really looking at. The NASCAR conspiracy. To understand why the Boss 429 exists, we need to go back to 1968, when Ford's racing program was in crisis. NASCAR had implemented new rules that required manufacturers to produce at least 500 street versions of any engine they wanted to use in competition. This was supposed to level the playing field and make racing more relevant to regular consumers. But Ford had a problem. Their NASCAR teams were getting destroyed by Chrysler's 426 Hemi, and their existing 427 engine just wasn't cutting it anymore. The solution came from Ford's Special Vehicle Operations Department. Build an entirely new engine specifically for NASCAR, one that would be so advanced it would make everything else obsolete. The project was codenamed Semi-Hemi, and it was unlike anything Ford had ever attempted. The new 429 cubic inch engine featured massive ports, huge valves, and a revolutionary combustion chamber design that borrowed heavily from Ford's Le Mans winning 427 race engines. In NASCAR trim, this engine was producing over 600 horsepower. Absolutely monstrous for 1969. But here's where Ford's corporate politics got messy. The insurance industry was already putting pressure on automakers to tone down the muscle car wars, and Ford's executives were terrified of the liability issues surrounding a 600 horsepower street car. At the same time, NASCAR's homologation rules meant they had to build exactly what they raced, or at least make it appear that way. So Ford devised a plan that was equal parts brilliant and deceptive. They would build the required 500 street cars, but they would deliberately detune the engine, use different camshafts, restrict the intake, and make dozens of other small changes that would reduce power output to a more acceptable level. To the casual observer, it would look like the same engine NASCAR was using. In reality, it was a completely different animal. The deception went even deeper. Ford deliberately underpromoted the Boss 429, burying it in their marketing materials and making it difficult for dealers to even order one Torx. They didn't want this car to be successful. They just wanted to meet NASCAR's minimum production requirements and get back to racing. But the engineers who were building these engines knew something that Ford's marketing department didn't want to admit. Even in street trim, the Boss 429 was capable of far more than Ford was willing to acknowledge. And some of those engineers were about to go rogue. The car-Kraft connection. Here's where the story gets really interesting. Ford didn't actually build the Boss 429 themselves. Instead, they outsourced the entire project to a small company in Brighton, Michigan called Kraft. This wasn't just any contractor. Kraft was Ford's secret weapon, a shadowy operation that specialized in building race cars and limited production vehicles that Ford's regular assembly lines couldn't handle. Kraft was founded by a group of former Ford engineers who had grown frustrated with corporate bureaucracy and wanted to build the kind of cars that Detroit's bean counters would never approve. They had already proven themselves with projects like the GT40 and the Shelby Cobra. But the Boss 429 would be their most ambitious undertaking yet. The process was incredibly complex. Ford would build regular Mustang bodies at their Dearborn plant, then ship them to Kraft completely stripped of engines and transmissions. At the Brighton facility, teams of skilled technicians would perform what amounted to major surgery on each car. First, they had to modify the engine bay. The 429 engine was simply too big to fit in a standard Mustang. So Kraft had to move the shock towers, relocate the battery to the trunk, and even modify the hood to clear the massive air cleaner. The front suspension had to be completely rebuilt with heavy-duty components that could handle the engine's enormous weight and torque output. But here's what Ford's corporate executives didn't know. The guys at Kraft were hot rodders at heart, and they weren't content to just build another neutered muscle car. Working in secret, often on their own time, they began developing modifications that would unlock the Boss 429's true potential. They discovered that with just a few simple changes, a different camshaft, headers instead of exhaust manifolds, and some carburetor tuning, the Street Boss 429 could produce well over 500 horsepower. Some of the more radical builds they experimented with were pushing 600 horsepower or more, making them virtually identical to the NASCAR engines in terms of output. The problem was, none of this could be official. Ford's corporate policy strictly forbade any modifications that would increase power output beyond what was listed on the factory specifications. But that didn't stop some of these modified engines from making their way into customer cars, often with a wink and a nod from the Kraft technicians who built them. Years later, some Boss 429 owners would discover that their stock engines were producing significantly more power than advertised, leading to speculation that Kraft had been secretly hot-rodding customer cars all along. Ford, of course, has never officially acknowledged this, but the evidence is pretty compelling. The insurance industry's secret war, while Ford was busy trying to downplay the Boss 429's capabilities, a much larger battle was brewing behind the scenes. The insurance industry had declared war on muscle cars, and they were using increasingly aggressive tactics to price performance vehicles out of the market. By 1969, insurance companies had developed sophisticated algorithms for calculating risk based on engine displacement, horsepower ratings, and vehicle weight. A young driver trying to insure a Boss 429 might face premiums that cost more than the car itself, effectively making these vehicles unattainable for most buyers. But the insurance companies weren't just relying on published specifications. They had teams of investigators who would actually test these cars to determine their real-world performance capabilities. This created a cat-and-mouse game between manufacturers and insurers, with companies like Ford going to extraordinary lengths to make their cars appear less powerful than they actually were. The Boss 429 was a perfect example of this deception in action. On paper, Ford claimed the engine produced a conservative 375 horsepower. Independent testing, however, consistently showed output figures in the 450-500 horsepower range, and that was with the deliberately restrictive factory setup. Ford's solution was to implement what they called insurance ratings, artificially low horsepower figures that bore no relationship to actual performance, but helped keep insurance costs manageable. The 375 horsepower rating for the Boss 429 was pure fiction, designed specifically to satisfy insurance company requirements. This created an interesting situation for buyers who were savvy enough to understand what they were getting. You could purchase what appeared to be a moderately powerful muscle car for reasonable insurance rates. But what you actually received was one of the most potent street machines ever built by an American manufacturer. The insurance industry eventually caught on to these tactics, leading to even more restrictive policies and higher premiums. But by then, the damage was done. Ford had successfully smuggled some of the most powerful engines they ever built past the insurance gatekeepers, hidden in plain sight behind conservative power ratings and deliberately low-key marketing. This deception had long-term consequences that Ford probably didn't anticipate. Because the Boss 429 was so underpromoted and misrepresented, many potential buyers passed it by in favor of more obviously powerful competitors. Production numbers remained low, dealers struggled to move inventory, and Ford ultimately lost money on the entire program. The engineering marvel hidden in plain sight. Let's talk about what made the Boss 429 engine so special, because this is where Ford's engineers really showed their brilliance. On the surface, it might look like just another big block V8, but underneath the hood was some of the most advanced engine technology available in 1969. The cylinder heads were the real star of the show. Ford developed what they called semi-hemispherical combustion chambers, which were essentially a compromise between the efficiency of a traditional wedge chamber and the power potential of Chrysler's full hemispherical design. This gave them excellent airflow characteristics while maintaining reasonable manufacturing costs. The intake ports were absolutely massive, larger than anything Ford had ever put on a production engine, combined with equally enormous exhaust ports. This meant the engine could move incredible amounts of air, which is the foundation of all horsepower production. The valves were huge too, 28 inches for the intakes and 1.9 inches for the exhausts, sizes that wouldn't look out of place on a modern racing engine. But here's what made the Boss 429 truly special. Ford's engineers didn't just make everything bigger and call it good. They carefully optimized every aspect of the design for maximum efficiency. The combustion chambers were precisely shaped to promote complete fuel burn. The intake manifold was tuned for optimal air distribution, and even the crankshaft was specially balanced to handle the engine's massive power output. The bottom end was built like a tank. The block featured 4-bolt main bearing caps, a feature typically reserved for race engines, and the rotating assembly was balanced to tolerances that exceeded most aftermarket performance parts. Ford knew this engine would be subjected to extreme abuse, both on NASCAR tracks and in the hands of enthusiastic street drivers. One of the most impressive aspects of the Boss 429 was its potential for modification. The basic architecture was so sound that it could handle enormous increases in power output with relatively simple changes. Replace the restrictive exhaust manifolds with headers, swap in a more aggressive camshaft, and tune the carburetor properly, and you could easily see power gains of 100 horsepower or more. This wasn't an accident. Ford's engineers deliberately overbuilt the engine so it could handle much more power than the factory specifications suggested. They knew that serious enthusiasts would want to modify their cars, and they wanted to make sure the Boss 429 could handle whatever owners threw at it. The transmission and drivetrain were equally impressive. The standard gearbox was Ford's legendary top-loader 4-speed, built specifically to handle the Boss 429's massive torque output. The rear axle featured a 9-inch differential with limited slip functionality, ensuring that all that power could actually make it to the ground. Even the suspension was special. Kraft didn't just drop the big engine into a standard Mustang chassis and hope for the best. They completely re-engineered the front suspension with heavy-duty components, added a larger sway bar, and modified the rear suspension to handle the engine's weight and torque characteristics. The dealers who didn't know what they had, here's one of the most fascinating aspects of the Boss 429 story. Most Ford dealers had absolutely no idea what they were selling. Ford's deliberately low-key marketing approach meant that these cars often sat on dealer lots for months, overlooked by salespeople who didn't understand their significance. Many dealers tried to market the Boss 429 as just another Mustang variant, competing directly with the more popular Boss 302 and Mach 1 models. But the Boss 429 was significantly more expensive, nearly $4,000 in 1969, which was serious money at the time. And its conservative power rating made it seem like poor value compared to the competition. What made this situation even more absurd was that some dealers actually tried to talk customers out of buying Boss 429s. The cars were difficult to service, parts were expensive and hard to find, and the engines required premium fuel and careful maintenance. From a dealer's perspective, it was much easier to sell a customer a regular Mustang that wouldn't come back with problems. This created some interesting opportunities for savvy buyers. Stories emerged of customers negotiating significant discounts on Boss 429s, simply because dealers were desperate to move inventory. Some cars sold for thousands below sticker price, making them one of the best performance bargains of the era for those who knew what they were buying. Most Ford technicians had never worked on a Boss 429 engine, and the specialized knowledge required to maintain these cars properly was in short supply. Ford's service manuals were deliberately vague about many aspects of the engine, partly to maintain the fiction that it was just a mildly modified production motor. This led to a lot of improperly maintained Boss 429s that developed problems early in their lives. Owners who didn't understand the engine's requirements would run regular gasoline instead of premium, skip oil changes, or attempt modifications without understanding the consequences. Many of these cars ended up being traded in or sold at significant losses. But for the owners who did their homework, the Boss 429 was an absolute revelation. These were people who understood that they had purchased something truly special, even if Ford wasn't willing to admit it publicly. They formed informal networks to share maintenance tips, performance modifications, and part sources. Some of the most knowledgeable Boss 429 owners developed relationships directly with the Kraft technicians who had built their cars. These connections proved invaluable for obtaining hard-to-find parts and getting advice on modifications that could safely increase performance. The dealer situation improved somewhat in 1970 as word began to spread about the Boss 429's true capabilities. But by then, Ford had already decided to discontinue the program, making the 1970 model year the last for this legendary engine. The racing heritage they couldn't advertise while Ford was busy downplaying the Boss 429's street capabilities. The NASCAR version was absolutely dominating racetracks across the country. This created a bizarre situation where Ford's most successful racing engine was also their most secretive street car. The NASCAR Boss 429s were monsters. With proper racing preparation, these engines were producing well over 600 horsepower and could propel a 3,500-pound stock car to speeds approaching 200 mph. They featured radical camshafts, massive carburetors, free-flowing exhaust systems, and internal components that were built to withstand the extreme stresses of competitive racing. Ford's racing teams quickly discovered that the Boss 429's design gave them significant advantages over the competition. The engine's excellent breathing characteristics meant it could maintain power output at high RPMs, where other engines would begin to fall off. The robust bottom end could handle the extreme loads of superspeedway racing without failure, giving Ford drivers confidence to push their cars to the absolute limit. But here's where Ford's corporate politics created a problem. They couldn't advertise these racing successes without drawing attention to the street version of the engine. The whole point of the conservative power ratings and low-key marketing was to keep the Boss 429 off the insurance industry's radar. Publicizing NASCAR victories would have completely undermined that strategy. This led to the surreal situation where Ford's most successful racing program was also their most secretive. Press releases about NASCAR victories carefully avoided mentioning specific engine details, and Ford's marketing department went to great lengths to avoid connecting the racing success with the street cars sitting on dealer lots. The racing heritage also created a pipeline for performance parts and modifications that could be applied to Street Boss 429s. Many of the components developed for NASCAR competition were adaptable to street use, though Ford could never officially acknowledge this connection. Some enterprising dealers and independent shops began offering racing-inspired modifications for Street Boss 429s, carefully avoiding any direct references to NASCAR components. These modifications could dramatically increase performance, often bringing street cars very close to racing specifications in terms of power output. The disconnect between racing success and street marketing also meant that many Boss 429 owners were completely unaware of their car's racing heritage. They had purchased what they thought was just another muscle car, not realizing they owned a street version of Ford's most dominant racing engine. This situation persisted throughout the Boss 429's production run. Even as Ford's NASCAR teams were winning races and championships, the company continued to market the street version as a mild-mannered performance car suitable for daily driving. The modification underground, because Ford deliberately underpromoted the Boss 429's capabilities. An underground network of enthusiasts and mechanics emerged to unlock the engine's true potential. These were people who understood that they had something special and were willing to go to considerable lengths to maximize its performance. The modification process usually started with the exhaust system. Ford's restrictive factory manifolds were one of the biggest limiting factors in the engine's performance, and replacing them with proper headers could yield immediate gains of 50 horsepower or more. But this wasn't just a simple bolt-on modification. The Boss 429's unique engine bay packaging meant that custom headers had to be specially designed and fabricated. Carburetor tuning was another area where significant gains could be realized. The factory Holley 735 CFM carburetor was adequate for the engine's conservative factory tune, but it was nowhere near large enough to feed a properly modified Boss 429. Upgrading to an 850 or even 950 CFM carburetor, combined with proper tuning, could unlock substantial additional power. The camshaft was perhaps the most critical modification. Ford's factory camshaft was deliberately chosen to provide good street manners and acceptable emissions, but it was far from optimal for maximum performance. Installing a more aggressive camshaft could transform the engine's character completely, turning a mild-mannered street car into an absolute monster. But here's where things got interesting. Some of the most effective Boss 429 modifications were actually NASCAR-derived components that had somehow made their way into the civilian market. These parts were never officially available through Ford's parts network, but they could sometimes be obtained through connections with racing teams or Kraft employees. The modification underground operated largely through word of mouth and informal networks. There were no internet forums or magazine articles detailing Boss 429 modifications. This knowledge was passed along through personal relationships and hard-earned experience. This made the learning curve steep for new owners. But it also created a tight-knit community of enthusiasts who were genuinely passionate about these cars. Some of the most radical Boss 429 modifications pushed the engines well beyond their original specifications. With the right combination of internal modifications, forced induction, and supporting systems, it was possible to extract 700 horsepower or more from these engines. These builds required extensive knowledge and considerable financial investment, but they demonstrated just how much potential Ford had built into the basic design. The modification underground also served as an informal parts network. Since Ford never intended the Boss 429 to be a high-volume seller, they didn't invest heavily in parts availability. When owners needed hard-to-find components, they often had to rely on other enthusiasts who might have spare parts or know where to find them. This network became even more important as the cars aged and original parts became increasingly scarce. By the 1980s and 1990s, Finding certain Boss 429 components required detective work and persistence, making the enthusiast community invaluable for keeping these cars on the road. The collector market, awakening for nearly 2 decades after production ended. Boss 429 Mustangs remained one of the muscle car world's best-kept secrets. While cars like the 1970 Plymouth Cuda and 1969 Dodge Charger were commanding premium prices at auctions, Boss 429s could still be found at reasonable prices, largely because their significance wasn't widely understood. This began to change in the late 1980s, as a new generation of collectors started to appreciate the technical sophistication and rarity of the Boss 429. These weren't just buyers looking for the fastest quarter-mile times or the most aggressive styling. They were enthusiasts who understood engineering excellence and appreciated the car's unique place in automotive history. The turning point came when automotive journalists finally began to investigate the real story behind the Boss 429. Magazine articles started appearing that detailed the car's NASCAR heritage, explained the sophisticated engine technology, and revealed the true performance potential that Ford had been hiding for decades. Suddenly, collectors realized they had been overlooking one of the most significant muscle cars ever built. The combination of extreme rarity, remember, only 1359 were ever built, advanced engineering, and racing pedigree made the Boss 429 incredibly desirable to serious collectors. Prices began to climb rapidly, especially for well-documented examples with known histories. The most valuable cars were those that could be traced back to their original Kraft build records, as this documentation proved authenticity and provided insight into the specific modifications and options each car received. The collector market also revealed some interesting facts about Boss 429 production that hadn't been widely known before. It turned out that many cars had been built with subtle variations that weren't reflected in Ford's official documentation. Some had different intake manifolds, others had unique carburetor setups, and a few even had internal engine modifications that suggested Kraft had been experimenting with different configurations. This discovery led to intensive research efforts by collectors and historians who wanted to document exactly how many Boss 429s were built and what variations existed. The work was complicated by the fact that Ford's records were incomplete, and Kraft had gone out of business years earlier, taking many of their build records with them. What emerged from this research was a more complete picture of just how special these cars really were. Far from being a simple production vehicle, each Boss 429 was essentially a hand-built machine that reflected the individual attention of the Kraft technicians who assembled it. The collector market also drove restoration efforts, as owners sought to return their cars to original condition. This created a demand for correct parts and components that hadn't existed when the cars were new, leading to the development of a specialized parts network focused specifically on Boss 429 needs. The modern legacy and shocking revelations today, more than 50 years after the last Boss 429 rolled off the Kraft assembly line, we're still discovering new information about these remarkable cars. Recent research has revealed details about the program that were kept secret for decades, and some of these revelations are genuinely shocking. Perhaps the most surprising discovery involves the true power output of Street Boss 429s. Modern dyno testing of properly maintained original engines has consistently shown power figures significantly higher than Ford's published ratings. While Ford claimed 375 horsepower, actual output appears to have been closer to 450-500 horsepower in most cases, with some engines producing even more. This wasn't the result of generous factory blueprinting or loose quality control. It appears to have been deliberate policy. Internal Ford documents that have come to light suggest that the company was well aware their published power figures were inaccurate, but they maintained the fiction to satisfy insurance and regulatory concerns. Even more shocking is evidence that some Street Boss 429s may have received NASCAR specification components directly from the factory. Build records from Kraft show that certain cars were equipped with camshafts, cylinder heads, or intake manifolds that were supposedly reserved for racing applications only. This suggests that the line between street and racing Boss 429s was much blurrier than Ford ever admitted publicly. Some lucky customers may have unknowingly purchased cars that were virtually identical to NASCAR engines in terms of specifications and performance potential. The revelation has led to intensive research efforts by collectors and historians, who are trying to identify which cars might have received these special components. The work is complicated by the fact that many of these parts look identical to standard components and can only be identified through detailed measurement and analysis. Another shocking revelation involves Ford's true intentions for the Boss 429 program. While the company always maintained that they built these cars reluctantly to satisfy NASCAR homologation requirements, internal correspondence suggests that some Ford executives saw the Boss 429 as a way to establish technological dominance in the muscle car market. Documents show that Ford's engineers were already working on even more radical versions of the Boss 429 engine, including designs that would have produced over 500 horsepower in street trim. These projects were canceled when Ford's management decided to withdraw from performance car development. But the plans show just how serious the company was about pushing the boundaries of production car performance. The modern collector market has also revealed the extent to which Boss 429s were modified over the years. Many cars show evidence of period modifications that were never documented, suggesting that the underground modification network was more extensive than previously realized. Some of these modifications were crude and damaged the car's value, but others were sophisticated improvements that actually enhanced performance and reliability. Sorting out which modifications are period correct and which are later additions has become a major challenge for collectors and restorers. Perhaps most shocking of all is the realization of just how close Ford came to canceling the entire Boss 429 program. Internal memos show that the project was nearly killed at least 3 times during development, and production was almost stopped after just a few hundred cars due to low sales and high costs. If any of these cancellation decisions had been finalized, we might never have seen the Boss 429 at all. The fact that these cars exist today is largely due to the determination of a small group of Ford engineers who believed in the project even when their corporate bosses were ready to abandon it. The ultimate automotive conspiracy, the story of the Ford Boss 429, is really the story of corporate America in the late 1960s. A time when insurance companies, government regulators, and safety advocates were all conspiring to end the muscle car era before it had really begun. Ford's response was to build one of the most sophisticated performance engines of all time, then pretend it was nothing special. For over 50 years, this deception worked almost perfectly. The Boss 429 remained a footnote in automotive history, known mainly to hardcore Ford enthusiasts and NASCAR fans. Meanwhile, less capable but better promoted competitors, like the 446 Pack and L6 Chevelle, achieved legendary status and commanded premium prices. But the truth has a way of coming out eventually. Today we know that the Boss 429 was probably the most advanced production engine built by any American manufacturer during the classic muscle car era. We know that Ford's conservative power ratings were pure fiction, designed to appease insurance companies rather than inform consumers. And we know that some of these street engines were virtually identical to the NASCAR power plants that were dominating racetracks across the country. Perhaps most importantly, we now understand that the Boss 429 represented a road not taken in American automotive history. This was Ford's vision of what a muscle car could be when engineering excellence took precedence over marketing concerns and cost considerations. It was a car built for enthusiasts who understood that true performance came from sophisticated design rather than just raw displacement. The fact that only 1,359 of these cars were built makes each one a piece of automotive history. These aren't just collectible muscle cars. They're artifacts from a time when American manufacturers were willing to build vehicles that prioritized performance over profitability, even if they couldn't admit it publicly. Today, as we face another era of automotive transformation with electric powertrains and autonomous driving systems, the Boss 429 serves as a reminder of what's possible when engineers are given the freedom to pursue excellence without compromise. It's a car that was 50 years ahead of its time in some ways, and one that even today represents the absolute pinnacle of American V8 engine development. The shocking truth behind the Boss 429 isn't just that Ford built a more powerful car than they admitted. It's that they built one of the greatest performance engines in automotive history, and then spent decades pretending it was nothing special. Only now, more than half a century later, are we finally beginning to understand what they really accomplished. And that might be the most shocking revelation of all. Sometimes the greatest automotive achievements are the ones nobody wants to talk about. We've reached the end of this video. Comment in the comments, like the video, subscribe, and tap the bell to enjoy future videos like this one. See you next time,